You're holding a stone that still has dust in its cracks, turning it in your hand, thumb over one edge, fingers testing the weight, and at first it just looks like a rock with ambitions. Then the shape starts to resolve. Two sides work toward each other. A point that seems intentional. A curve that fits the palm a little too well to be accidental. And suddenly, you are not just looking at an object. You are looking at repeated decisions, missed blows, corrected angles, patience, force, restraint. Somebody stood somewhere in wind and grit and animal smell and took a lump of stubborn mineral and tried to make it obey an idea. That matters because the moment you notice that effort, you are no longer asking only what ancient people made. You're asking what kind of minds they had to become in order to make it. Did perfectionism help ancient toolmakers? Let's go through it properly. The easy assumption is that better tools came from people who simply cared more, tried harder, and kept chasing cleaner, more perfect forms. Except that's not actually how it worked. Start with the simplest point, because it matters more than it seems. A useful stone tool does not need to be beautiful. It does not need mirror symmetry. It does not need the kind of finish that makes a museum visitor line in and whisper. The earliest stone technologies, the ones usually grouped under the Alduin, were often about getting a sharp cutting edge fast. Strike a core with enough control, detach a flake, and you suddenly have something that can cut flesh, scrape plant material, work hide, maybe open access to marrow. That is already a serious evolutionary advantage. Sharp beats blunt. Fast beats empty-handed. In those cases, what helps is not perfectionism. It's sufficiency. Good enough right now. But even that gets complicated the moment you look closer, because good enough in stone toolmaking is not casual. It still requires knowing where to hit, at what angle, with what force, and on what kind of stone. To an untrained eye, a broken rock is a broken rock. To a napper, the fracture surface holds a logic. Some materials break predictably, in smooth, curved fractures, if you strike them correctly. Others fight you. Others crumble. Others hide internal flaws like a rotten beam inside clean paint. So the first lesson ancient toolmakers learned was not how to be perfect. It was how to negotiate with matter. That sounds abstract. It is. It's the difference between a clean, ringing blow and a useless shatter that sends flakes into your lap and leaves you with less tool than you started with. Now let's talk about Acheulean hand axes, because this is where the word perfectionism starts to feel tempting. These tools appear around 1.7 million years ago and persist in various forms for an astonishing stretch of time. Many are bifaces, meaning they're worked on both sides. Some are rough, some are elegant, some are so symmetrical that they almost look modern, as if a design brief had been faxed backward through time. For a long time, that symmetry invited a very human conclusion. Surely these makers were chasing the perfect shape because the perfect shape worked better. There's a real argument for a small version of that. A balanced hand axe can sit well in the hand. A regular edge can make some actions easier. Experimental work on butchery suggests that symmetry may contribute a little to performance. Maybe by making the tool easier to orient quickly after it rotates in your grip. If you are cutting hide, separating joints, moving from one motion to another, that tiny improvement is not nothing. But it's also not the full story. In experiments comparing hand axe form to butchery effectiveness, symmetry explains only a small amount of the difference in performance. Not none. Small, that distinction is the whole game here. A very symmetrical tool is not automatically a much better cutting tool. Sometimes individual edge sharpness, local irregularities, grip, stone quality, and simple situational fit matter more than the overall visual neatness of the artifact. In other words, the thing can look perfect and still not be the best tool in that exact moment. That should make you pause, because it means ancient toolmakers were sometimes investing effort beyond immediate functional payoff. And that opens the next spoke in the wheel. Maybe perfection, or something like it, helped not because it made every tool drastically better, but because it stabilized a process. Making a hand axe is not one hit. It is a sequence. One removal sets up the next. One bad scar can ruin the platform, and a platform is the spot from which you strike the next flake. Miss the sequence early, and later options collapse. So what looks like perfectionism from outside may actually be planning discipline from inside. You don't chase a clean outline because you're vain about rocks. You chase it because orderly geometry preserves future possibilities. It keeps the core workable. It keeps the edge recoverable. It keeps the whole reduction sequence. Reduction here just means gradually shaping the stone by removing pieces from falling apart. That is where expert and novice toolmakers really separate. Novices tend to focus on the current blow. Experts are already living 2 or 3 removals ahead. They anticipate ridges, convexities, edge angles, the way one flake scar will steer the next fracture. This is why experimental archaeology, where modern people learn to nap under controlled conditions, is so useful. Beginners often hit too hard, or too soft, or at the wrong angle, or on the wrong platform, and they create a mess that feels irreversible almost instantly. Experts do not eliminate error. They manage it earlier. They see trouble coming while it still looks like a minor asymmetry. That is less like obsessive perfectionism and more like high-level error control. Now let's talk about symmetry itself, because symmetry does strange things to the human mind. We are drawn to it. We notice it quickly. We often read it as evidence of control. That may have mattered in prehistory too. Some researchers have argued that highly symmetrical hand axes could have functioned partly as social signals, maybe even sexual signals, or at least as demonstrations of skill. The claim here is not that every hand axe was a prehistoric dating profile. That gets silly fast. The narrower point is that costly skill displays exist in many species, and in humans, technical finesse can carry social information. If somebody can repeatedly transform stone into a refined, balanced form that may signal practiced hands, planning ability, patience, access to good raw material, maybe even participation in a community that teaches and values those standards. And again, the complication lands immediately. Social signaling is plausible, but it is hard to prove from stone alone. Archaeology preserves the object, not the glance that met it, not the reputation that followed it, not the apprentice watching from 3 meters away. So we should not romanticize this into a neat story where every beautiful hand axe was basically a resume. Still, once you accept that function alone does not explain all the symmetry, the door opens to shared standards, social evaluation, and learned ideals. A perfect-looking tool might help because it cuts. It might also help because it teaches, impresses, reassures, or marks competence. Sometimes one object can do all of that at once. So let's look at the evidence from another angle. Ancient toolmaking was never just about the final object. It was about transmission. How does one generation get the next one to stop wasting stone, stop bruising their hands, stop turning good raw material into rubble? Social learning matters here, and not in a soft, decorative way. It matters mechanically. Many stone technologies are hard to learn from the finished product alone. You can stare at a hand axe all day and still not know the exact sequence that produced it. That means demonstration, imitation, correction, repetition, and long practice probably mattered a great deal. A refined form can function as a target. Not a perfect target in the modern neurotic sense. A norm. A shared standard. Something like, this is what a competent version looks like, now work toward it. That may be one reason certain forms persisted for so long. Not because every maker was independently rediscovering the ideal geometry from pure reason. And not because evolution wrote every blow into the genes. But because communities can stabilize habits. They teach attention. They reward recognizable outcomes. They make some mistakes visible and others tolerable. And once you have that, perfectionism starts to blur into something older and more collective, norm following. You do not need an inner monologue saying, "This edge must be flawless." You may only need repeated exposure to a local standard, repeated correction, repeated practice, until your hands begin to feel wrongness before you can even explain it. Now here's something that almost nobody talks about. Sometimes the most impressive thing about an ancient tool is not the polish of the final form, but the restraint of the maker. Stone toolmaking invites overwork. You can keep chasing symmetry, keep trimming, keep thinning, keep correcting. Right up to the point where you ruin the edge, snap the tip, or shrink the tool into mediocrity. Anyone who has ever edited a sentence to death will recognize the pattern. More control can become less wisdom. So the truly skilled napper is not the one who cannot stop perfecting. It's the one who knows when to stop. That matters because over-refinement has costs. Time is a cost. Risk is a cost. Material loss is a cost. If you are a hominin on an open landscape and the day includes hunger, movement, predators, social obligations, children, weather, maybe butchering before scavengers arrive, then every extra minute spent chasing elegance has to earn its keep. This is one reason archaeologists resist single-cause explanations. Some hand axes may have been everyday work tools. Some may have been produced under conditions where stone was abundant and time costs were lower. Some unusually large or exquisitely made pieces may have had special roles we still do not fully understand. There is no clean universal motive hiding under every flake scar. Now let's talk about later prepared core technologies, especially Levallois, because they give us a useful comparison. In plain language, Levallois is a method where the maker carefully prepares a stone core, so that a desired flake can be struck off in a relatively controlled shape later. The intelligence here is not just in the final blow. It is in building the conditions for the final blow. You create the geometry first, then cash it in. That kind of process is often treated as evidence of advanced planning, and fairly so. But even here, the best description is not perfectionism. It is structured flexibility. The maker has a goal, yes, but the stone still answers back. Internal flaws appear. Edges dull. Convexities shift. The napper must adapt. And that comparison helps us with the Acheulean question. If later technologies show even more obvious planning depth, then the story of ancient toolmaking is not a simple march toward visual perfection. It is a history of increasingly sophisticated ways of organizing action under material constraint. Sometimes that produces cleaner forms. Sometimes it produces more efficient flakes. Sometimes it produces standardization. But the engine underneath is not a mystical devotion to perfect objects. It is the gradual refinement of attention, sequence, and learned judgment. Now let's talk about raw material because it keeps humbling every tidy theory. A maker working fine flint is not dealing with the same possibilities as a maker working quartzite or basalt or another less predictable stone. Some stones almost invite cleaner shaping, others punish ambition. So when archaeologists compare artifacts across regions and time periods, they have to keep asking whether a difference reflects cognition, culture, function, available material, or all of them tangled together. A lopsided hand axe might record poor skill, or awkward stone or rushed production, or a different intended use, or a decision that this was already good enough. The artifact is real, the motive is always partly hidden. Now, and this is essential, so I'm going to slow all the way down here. We should be careful with the word perfectionism itself. In modern psychology, perfectionism often means more than high standards. It can mean a painful concern with mistakes, harsh self-evaluation, chronic dissatisfaction, the inability to stop revising, the feeling that anything short of flawless is failure. We do not have evidence that ancient toolmakers lived inside that emotional structure. A beautiful biface is not a fossilized anxiety disorder. It is a shaped stone. That sounds obvious, but people forget it. We are tempted to project our own mental categories backward because the artifact feels so intimate, like evidence of personality. Sometimes it is evidence of personality. More often it is evidence of process. There is another caution too. Perfection can be costly in ways that are not admirable. If a community enforces narrow standards too rigidly, innovation can slow. If learners are punished for every mistake, practice becomes fear-driven. If the form matters more than the task, you can end up preserving ritual neatness while losing practical flexibility. Some researchers have even pointed out that technologies can remain stable for very long periods, not because nobody could imagine alternatives, but because local ways of doing things become durable, teachable, and socially anchored. Stability is not the same thing as stagnation. It can be a sign that the system works well enough. But it does mean we should not confuse standardization with some pure upward curve of technical virtue. So now let's return to the central question. Did perfectionism help ancient toolmakers? The honest answer the evidence allows is, sometimes, but probably not in the way the word first suggests. If by perfectionism you mean careful attention to symmetry, edge control, planning depth, and the disciplined reduction of avoidable error, then yes, that helped. It helped makers preserve future options in the stone, produce more regular tools, teach others more effectively, and maybe signal competence within a group. In that sense, striving toward a refined form could absolutely matter. But if by perfectionism you mean that ancient technology advanced because toolmakers were driven by a simple obsession with flawless objects, then no, that is too shallow and probably wrong. Function alone does not explain refined hand axes. Symmetry seems to offer only modest direct benefits in some tasks. Social standards, learning environments, raw material constraints, local traditions, display value, and practical stopping points all matter. The better word might be precision, or foresight, or skilled restraint, maybe even care. Because care can include asymmetry when asymmetry is what the stone, the task, or the moment demands. And that last part is what makes this bigger than archaeology. You can feel in these objects an old human tension that has never gone away. The wish to impose form, the need to adapt when matter resists, the temptation to overwork, the wisdom of stopping, the relief of good enough, the pride of getting it cleaner than last time, the quiet knowledge that somebody else will judge the result, maybe use it, maybe learn from it. A stone tool is not just a tool. It is a record of a mind trying to coordinate intention, technique, and uncertainty without ever getting complete control. That is probably why these artifacts still feel strangely alive. Not because they are perfect, because they are legible struggles. You can almost see the maker inside the sequence, setting up a platform, reading a ridge, correcting an edge, accepting one flaw, refusing another, deciding that one more blow will help, or deciding, finally, that one more blow will ruin everything. And that is not ancient in the dead sense. That is your life too. Different materials. Same argument. You make plans inside resistant worlds. You inherit standards you did not invent. You learn by watching, by failing, by repeating, by feeling the difference between control and damage. Sometimes your best work comes from pushing harder. Sometimes it comes from backing off at exactly the right second. Sometimes the thing that looks most polished from the outside is not the thing that served best. Sometimes the rougher tool fed people. So no, the story was never that ancient toolmakers became powerful because they loved perfection. It was that they became dangerous, adaptive, and deeply human. Because they learned when precision mattered, when tradition mattered, when display mattered, and when the stone itself got the final vote. The hand axe was never just a perfect shape. It was an argument with reality.